Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on 5 key shifts of post-pandemic leadership. My name is Hannah Jansen, and I'm the marketing manager here at Bluepoint. Joining us today is Joan Peterson, Vice President of Bluepoint. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, this webinar will be recorded and you'll receive a copy of the recording. Secondly, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them in the Q&A panel. Third, if you have any questions after the webinar, you can email us at info@bluepointleadership.com or call us at 888-221-8685. All right, I'm going to pass things over to Joan.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about this idea of 5 key shifts that leaders really need to make post-pandemic. My name's Joan Peterson. As Hannah suggested, I work with an organization called Bluepoint Leadership Development. Delighted to be able to spend some time with you really talking about this idea of leadership and leadership today. If you look back 18 months, 12 months, we all heard the words, the Great Resignation, mass exodus from organizations post-pandemic. Probably 6 months after that, it wasn't really the Great Resignation, and it was the Great Reshuffle, right? We're not leaving organizations, we're shifting where we're going. And then if you kind of go back 6 months or so, maybe less than that, the words started changing from the Great Reshuffle to quiet quitting. And one of my clients told me a couple of weeks ago, there's also quiet firing or silent firing and silent quitting. All those things. I mean, that's frightening. Those last two, I think, are more frightening than the Great Resignation and the Great Reshuffle, because those other two, the quiet quitting, isn't that people are quitting, is that they're quitting and they're staying in the job and they're doing the bare minimum. And that silent firing is that people are staying and their leaders are treating them as if they weren't there. So we look at leadership, taking all that into consideration. The news, again, when we look at what's Gallup saying, Gallup is saying that the ratio of engaged to disengaged workers is the worst it's been in 10 years. That there's more disengagement, of course, that's the quiet quitting piece, inside organizations, again, than there's been in 10 years. And what they're saying is that workers 35 and under are the most susceptible to that disengagement. Leadership impacts all of that. So when I show up as a leader, when I show up inside organizations, I can impact that engagement to disengagement. I can impact that quiet quitting. And that's really where I'd like to spend our time today. Gallup talked about the fact that not only are workers 35 and under most susceptible to disengagement, but there are levers we can pull in order to change that. People want to feel cared for. I mean, it seems so simple, but I want to work at a place where I feel as if the people that I work with see me as a human being. They don't treat me as someone who gets stuff done, although I do need to get stuff done, but they actually care about me as a human being. I want to work at a place where I have opportunities to develop. This isn't about promotion. It is about I'm more likely to stay inside an organization where I can feel as if others are developing me. And the last is I want to feel as if my work has purpose and meaning. I want to be able to wake up and go into a job or work from home in a job where I feel like I make a difference. So those three, again, based on some of the most recent research that's been done, are foundational when we talk about this idea of key leadership shifts. And when we look at it, really, we're looking at some thoughts around mindset changes that leaders really need to have in the current environment. And we'll look at them in 5 different categories, if you will. The first is around change. And how do we need to shift our thinking around change inside organizations? The second, it says leadership is really around strategic leadership. What's my mindset around leading others strategically? The third is how do I communicate? How do I look at communication? What do I see my role as around communicating inside the organization? The fourth is around development. What's important for me as a leader in terms of how I develop myself and how I develop others. And the last is around accountability. These shifts take into consideration, I still need to get my job done. I mean, we know that organizations are difficult places to be quite often now. And I need to keep flying the plane. I need to make sure that we have the highest productivity, the highest engagement, the highest accountability possible. So let's look at that first idea around change. And when we look at change, again, I believe this one is foundational, because when we look at this topic of change, what I need to do as a leader really impacts those other four. So this idea of change is I need to go from thinking about change as being episodic, right? Oh gosh, I can't wait until I finish this change so that we can go back to normal. Well, we all know that's not the case. Change is continuous. So as a leader, I need to believe that, you know what, the only thing constant is this idea that we're constantly going to be changing. And I love this quote. John Maxwell said, change is inevitable, growth is optional. I believe that's the mindset we need to have as leaders, that the organization is going to be going through changes, large scale change, small scale change. How we adapt to it, how we grow around it is the optional piece. And that's where leadership is required. We do a lot of work with organizations around leading change. And one of the things that we oftentimes ask our participants is this question. And you may have heard me ask this before. Do you believe people naturally resist change? Show of hands. And quite often the whole room will raise their hand. And then we ask a different question, similar, but it's, well, do you naturally resist change? And this is where you kind of get a little nervous laughter. So everyone believes that everyone else naturally resists change. And it's like, well, they resist the change. I don't know that I do so much. So the interesting thing here is that people do not naturally resist change. We're hardwired to change. Think about it. Some of the biggest changes we go through as human beings, we choose our career path, we choose potentially to get married, we choose to move, we choose where to live. So we're hardwired to change. But quite often inside organizations, what we see is people not quite choosing the change. So we see what we believe is resistance to change. So as leaders, I have a role in that. And if Keegan and Leahy wrote a book called Immunity to Change a few years back. And what they talked about from their research is we don't really resist the change per se. We're just deeply committed to something else. So think about how this shows up inside organizations. Man, my job, change comes across. And it's like, I'm not necessarily resisting the change, but I'm deeply committed to some of the things that are currently on my plate. For example, three universal competing commitments that we see inside organizations that really show up as resistance to change. The first is this idea, and this comes from some of the work in Drive. Like, we don't want to be unimportant. So that is, I want to be part of something that's bigger than me. I want to feel as if I have an important role inside the organization. And most of us, once we start to get comfortable in a role inside an organization, we recognize where we add value. So if you change the rules on me and you start to introduce changes inside the organization, like all of a sudden, competing commitment, I don't know how important I'm going to be in that new tomorrow, whatever that looks like. The second competing commitment is I don't want to appear incompetent. That is, again, if I'm in a role in an organization where I'm confident in the job that I'm doing, I'm confident in the role that I have. Again, you change how I do things, or you change where I report, or you change the structure. I might not be as confident that I will be as capable. So the competing commitment shows up as resistance. And the third piece is around autonomy. We all want to have autonomy around how we do our jobs. We all want to have autonomy around how we get what we need to get in terms of results. And again, if you change the environment around me and I lose that autonomy, shows up as resistance to change. So my role as a leader is to see what's going on around me. And if I recognize resistance, to start to think about, okay, what's the competing commitment here? And how can I impact that? What might I need to do in order to serve that person differently? Leaders, if you look at those three competing commitments, I believe our role, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, our role is to convey and invite people's connection to purpose and meaning. So as times are changing, as things are changing, as structures are changing, we need to help people feel as if they're part of whatever it is we're moving toward, that they see the purpose and meaning. The second is around building competence and confidence. This is around that development piece. I want to feel as if I can add value. I want to feel as if I'm capable. Leaders have a role there to develop, to build skill, and to build confidence. And the third, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is this idea of inviting accountability. That is helping people take accountability, responsibility for what they own. And more about that in just a few minutes. I'd like to go to the second piece, which is around this idea of leadership or strategic leadership, because it looks at this idea of meaning and purpose. When we think about the change that leaders need to make or shift that leaders need to make, we need to shift from being vision driven to being purpose driven. So what does that mean? Probably you go back 10 years, even now you walk into some organizations and on the wall as you walk in is the organization's mission and sometimes their vision and sometimes their values. And I think all that is important. I believe as leaders, the shift we need to make is to help individuals recognize the why behind it. Yep, we need to be headed somewhere. We can't not have a vision or a mission. And what we need to look at inside organizations today is how do I connect people from a purpose perspective to that vision? Excuse me, Marilyn Hewson, who was Lockheed Martin, ran Lockheed Martin for many years, said good leaders organize and align people around what the team needs to do. Great leaders motivate and inspire people with why they're doing it. We have a responsibility as leaders, especially now, to connect individuals with the purpose. IBM in 2021 did some research around organizations and those that outperformed others. And what they found is that the higher performing organizations identified purpose and mission as critical to engaging employees at a rate 53% higher than those that were underperformers. So they saw there was huge power in helping connect people to purpose. And our responsibility, our role as a leader is really threefold around purpose. It's to help people connect what's important to them, their meaning and purpose, what gets me personally out of bed in the morning, to the team's purpose. And then it's connecting all of that to the organization's purpose. And I'd like to start not at the top, I'd like to start at the bottom around individual's purpose. I'd like you to think about, for you, what's important to you? Like, what do you stand for? What are your values? And we listed some on the screen here. There are likely many others that we don't have listed. But I'll ask you to just read through some of these words. And if you had to pick 3 or 4 or 5, which would you choose as the most meaningful for you? Like, what is purpose and meaning for you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What drives you to work in the morning? Which are most important? Like for me, when I look at the list, there's a few that stand out for me. Achievement is important to me. I want to feel as if, we're achieving success as an organization. I want to feel as if I'm adding to that. Development is important to me. I spend a lot of my work looking at not only developing myself, developing those around me. So those strike me as being really important. Challenge. I like a challenge. I am energized by challenges around me. Relationships, important to me as well. So as you look at this list, which would you choose for yourself? And that's, I think, where we start. So this is what drives me. How can I connect that with what we do every day? How do I connect what's meaning and purpose for me to what our team does and to what the organization does? And I think as leaders, we need to start from within. And we need to recognize that our teams likely would choose differently than we would. So I believe we need to find out what makes people tick. We need to find out what people stand for. And oftentimes we'll ask leaders inside our workshops or my coaching clients. So if you don't know, how do you find out? And most people answer, I ask them. And I think perfectly appropriate to engage in a conversation around that. But I also think we quite often we don't need to ask people. We just need to listen differently. We'll talk about what they stand for by the language they use. When we're in conversations with people, we know what lights them up. We know when they get excited. It's listening differently for this. Once I know what people stand for, makes it much easier for me to connect that with what we do inside the organization. I love this quote, and my hope is that you recognize what this means for you. And I think our role, our responsibilities as leaders is to recognize what this is for everyone around us as well. It says, and every day the world will drag you by the hand, yelling, "This is important and this is important. You need to worry about this and this and this." And each day it's up to you to yank your hand back, put it on your heart, and say, "No, this is what's important." But if I haven't thought about it, or I don't know what that is for me or those around me, it's really difficult for me to be able to see the why, for me to be able to see the purpose. I think we do. Well, how do I connect team members to our purpose? I think I first find out what matters most to them. And then I look to connect it with the team's purpose. A couple of thoughts on team's purpose. I believe that leaders can start to talk about this and start to come up with, okay, for our team, what's our compelling purpose? On the screen are 6 questions that might start that conversation. What's your team's most important work and whom do you serve? What's exceptional work look like? How does the organization's success depend on your team's great work? What ways can your team exceed all expectations? What's special and distinctive about your team? What makes you most proud? How can every team member have a starring role? And what exciting future awaits your team? I'm not suggesting you ask all these. I am suggesting that you do engage in a conversation with your team, talking about what's our purpose? What do we stand behind? One of my colleagues was doing a similar exercise with a nursing home, a healthcare facility, and he started the conversation by asking them, okay, what's this team's compelling purpose? And one of the gentlemen in the room raised their hand and said, we care for old people. And he's like, yeah, you do. And then he started to dig a bit deeper. And what the team came up with, US based nursing home, they came up with this. What we do is we help give the greatest generation a place to call home where they can share and be honored for their life story. And that's a purpose. And to tell you, when I'm going into a senior facility, my hope is that my kids put me in one where this is their compelling purpose and not I care for old people. So what is your team's compelling purpose? And then I think it is important to help those around you understand the organization's purpose. And sometimes what I hear inside organizations is, what we do isn't really like a Bombas socks, right? Where every sock sold, we give a pair of socks to a homeless facility, homeless shelter. This was in HBR. There are 3 types of purpose. And I think even thinking about purpose this way at your team and inside the organization is not purpose isn't the same inside different organizations. Sometimes the function that your product serves is purpose, right? Like you create something that's meaningful, new medication, new research, something that will help people live better lives. That's a competence purpose. The cause purpose, that's the social good. That's like the Bombas and the Patagonias. How do we serve socially with what we do? And for many organizations, there's a cultural purpose. So that's the intent with which we run our business. So that's the culture we create internally. So I think it's thinking about, well, what does purpose mean for us inside our organization from an organizational perspective? Inside this bucket, if you will, around purpose, I believe sits this idea of community building. And if we think about what happened during the pandemic is we went from many of us working under one roof and having organic communities being built, right? I could walk by somebody's desk and I had these relationships where I saw people every day. To Zoom calls, where some of the communities were shut down, some weren't nurtured, some went a bit deeper. What we heard post pandemic is that some of our networks got stronger, but they were much fewer. We interacted with fewer and fewer people. I believe that we have a role as leaders to be really intentional about community building. And when I talk about community building, I mean this, like work groups, we have integrated activities. Team, we have integrated activities. We're committed to the work. Community, integrated activities, committed to the work, and committed to each other. We find is that the highest producing, highest engaged groups see themselves as a community. Like I not only care about the work, but I care about the people around me. We have a responsibility as leaders to intentionally create that community, because it in many places, especially those where we're now working remotely or hybrid, they're not it doesn't happen as organically as it did prior to the pandemic. There was a book that was put out, we're going back a number of years, called Bowling Alone, and it looked at communities inside the US. It's US based, and it looked at, with the decline of bowling leagues, communities started to disintegrate a bit. When we think about this idea of community, like we weren't as apt to go to our neighbors and ask for a cup of sugar. As we stopped spending more time together, as we started spending more time in our homes, the internet and Netflix, and we had less need to belong to civic associations or bowling leagues. But what they found is that even though the communities started to shift in terms of not looking like a community, it can be created. And I believe that's what leaders need to do. Leaders need to be really thoughtful about, am I creating a community where individuals feel appreciated, they recognize that there's a significant common cause, and they have strong connections with those around them. And if it does not happen organically, I need to be intentional about making sure I appreciate others, making sure people are connected to the purpose, and connecting individuals inside my team and other teams with each other, so that to reinforce that community that again went away a bit during the pandemic. The third shift is around communication. And this is, I do think that as leaders, especially if we're remote, especially in times of change, I have a role in sharing accurate and timely information. But what we oftentimes hear is, okay, more communication is better. More communication is not better. Better communication is better. And if I shift my thought from just sharing information to having conversations two-way that matter, I shift engagement inside organizations. So and this really comes from the mindset that most leadership happens one conversation at a time. And I think that the question that we all need to think about is this: like, when you think about the conversations that you've had today, you had yesterday, last week, do others leave conversations with you better in some way? Do they leave energized, engaged, challenged, with feedback? Or do they leave maybe with a piece of information? Quite often, I think we go into conversations and we're really, really busy, and we go with a piece of information we want to share, or a piece of information we need to walk out with. Transactional. And I oftentimes will ask participants in our workshop, how many conversations do you have every day? And I hear lots of different answers, usually anywhere from 15 to 20 to hundreds. And it's percentage-wise, how many of those would you say are meaningful? That is, the other person leaves better in some way. Challenge you at the end of every day to think about the conversations you've had. Did you have conversations that were meaningful? And what maybe missed opportunities were there? I believe that we talk about people want to feel cared for. Engagement is connected to that. Think about the conversations that you have. Does the other person feel heard? Do they feel seen? Do they trust you? And do they feel better about themselves in your presence? And that's the real litmus test is, am I present with the person? Do I see them? Like, do they trust me? Am I trustworthy? Do they feel better about who they are when I'm with them? And I think especially now more than ever, people have a desire to be heard. And a lot of the underlying pieces of this, having conversations that matter, really is around empathy. It's really around empathetic listening. Am I able to not just communicate, let me deliver a message, but am I able to engage in a conversation where I can empathetically listen to the other person? I get totally present. And I can put away my own agenda, my own concerns, my own issues, so that I can be with that person. Am I able to tune out the noise? That I become curious. Do I see the other person as somebody who can add to the conversation? Do I ask questions? This is the third one, do I seek to explore and learn? Do I look to see who that person is and what they can add to the conversation? Do I welcome silence? The researchers tell us we can't do two things with words at the same time. So think about it. The next time you're in a conversation and you start to plan what you're going to say next while the other person is talking, you've really stopped listening. So welcome silence. It's okay if there's a beat or two of silence after the other person has spoken so that you can think about what's the best next step. And that's really tough for some people to welcome that silence, to give time to actually listen to the other person. And the fifth really is about in the moment asking yourself, well, what's it like to be this person right now? Really important now, more than ever. As people are facing all sorts of different things inside and outside work. Are we able to put ourselves in their shoes? Like, what must it be like to be them? So as you look at this list, I'm going to ask you just to think for yourself. Which ones of these comes most naturally for you? Which do you do really well? How can you leverage that? So for me, uh, I'm, I'm a I'm more introverted, so the silence piece is not a challenge for me. So that comes most naturally for me. So which is again, comes most naturally for you? Let's take a moment to look at that list. As well, like which one of these do you really need to be more intentional about? And for me, it's that first one. I you got a lot going on, especially outside of work. My kids will tell you I need to work on that first one, probably more than the others. I need to really think about and be intentional about tuning out the noise before I engage in a conversation with others. Again, take a look at the list. Which one will you commit to becoming more intentional about? When I start to empathetically listen, be intentional about doing these five things, tend to connect with people on a much different level, tend to communicate with others on a much different level. And quite often when we do this, we can also listen for and hear what their purpose and meaning is, which of course we've already talked about. And this idea of building trust, I bring this up because I think, especially for those individuals who are leading remotely or leading hybrid teams, we do need to be intentional about this. Do I build trust? And I'll share. This came from HBR as well. The neuroscience of trust. It says manage behaviors that foster trust. The first, and you'll see some of the things that we've already talked about, or we'll talk about in a bit. The first is around appreciation. Do I see people at their best and tell them about it? The second, that's how I build trust, by doing that. The second is around challenging others. When we talk about accountability, there's a bit of challenge stress there. This is about seeing people as human beings with potential and challenging them to step up. We'll talk about autonomy as well, that idea of helping people take accountability and autonomy for the outcomes they own, which ties into job crafting. Sharing information broadly, that's the communication piece. Intentionally building relationships, that's the community piece. And then growing others and showing vulnerability. So all of this ties together. And again, trust, extremely important for us as leaders to be intentional about building trust, not just with our team, but with those around the organization. Vulnerability, I think, becomes increasingly important in times of change. And that is letting people know we're not perfect as leaders. There's this idea of the beautiful mess effect. And it's, well, I don't want to share with people, what I'm not good at or mistakes I've made, because they might think less of me. Well, the beautiful mess effect is the exact opposite that happens. When I am responsibly transparent or responsibly vulnerable, when I let people know what I'm working on, or maybe some of the struggles I've had, and challenges or obstacles that I've faced, quite often they think more highly of me. And that again builds our builds trust with others. The fourth shift is around development. And it's looking at this idea of, as a leader, I need to develop myself. I think we do. I think leadership development is self-development. But really, now we need to continuously develop not only ourselves, but we need to be thinking about continuously developing others. And average leaders set the bar for themselves, and raise the bar on themselves. Good leaders raise the bar for others. Great leaders inspire others to raise their own bar. As a leader, I have a responsibility to develop others. And some of the most current research, again, I shared this before, was that people will stay in jobs inside organizations where they feel as if they're being developed, where they feel as if somebody cares. This is, again, not about promotions. It is about helping people learn and grow. So I'm going to ask you to think about your own career. What have been the greatest contributors to your development? And write those down. Like, what are the kinds of things, people, jobs, roles, training, books that have been the greatest contributors to your development? And it's an interesting question, because I think sometimes we don't think about it. I don't know how I've developed. Think back. And my invitation to you is to continue to wrestle with that question. How have I developed? And how am I going to pay that forward? Am I a positive force for the learning and development of others? Do I help connect people to resources, mentors, roles, jobs that will help them develop? Do I engage in conversations around development? And I'd like to share some conversation components that you may have with some of your team members, again, around this idea of development. And it's in the form of a model, and it looks at 5 things. Core ideals, we've already talked about that. It looks at strengths, my personal qualities. It looks at key aspirations. What am I looking to do? Looks at options. Well, if that's what I'm looking to do, what are the options before me? And then what am I going to do about it? So let's look at each of these components individually. And specifically, I'd like to share a few thought starters, a few questions that you could potentially ask people in a conversation like this. And the first one around core ideals. What would it be like if you asked those people on your team, those people around you, like, what matters most to you? For what do you want to be known? What's your legacy do you want to be known for? For what are you most grateful? To help people start to explore this idea of core ideals and what brings purpose and meaning to their lives. Once we know that, and again, I recognize that we talked about this first off. Once we know that, it makes it so much easier for us to connect change and growth and development to what's foundationally important to others. The second is around asking people to really think about their own strengths, to think about what makes them special, what makes them different. And maybe it's not asking them what's special about you. Maybe it is. I really like asking people, well, what can you do better than most anyone else? Think about asking that of your team members. What if somebody asked you that question? How would you answer it? I think sometimes we'd be surprised at how people respond to that. Gives us a lot of information as leaders. Gives us information to tap into, maybe strengths we didn't know the person had. And then the third question I really like as well. When you're at your very best, what are you doing? And again, I think as leaders, if I can tap into what can you do better than most anyone else, and what does it take for you to be at your best? I'm much better at leading when I know that. The third piece is around key aspirations. And quite often when I talk about talent development to some of our clients, they get a little nervous. I don't want to have a talent development conversation. And the biggest fear is, what if I can't give them what they're asking for? What if I can't give them what they expect or what they want, that next promotion or the like? And it does say key aspiration. And my invitation to you is to think about aspiration as this. Like aspiration, there's no finish line. It's an aspiration is not, I want that next promotion. It's really the pursuit of a higher purpose. So what do I aspire to do? Again, it's no finish line. It's talking about, well, what does that mean for us? Ambition, that's time bound. That's the pursuit of defined achievement. So I think if we engage in conversation, potentially around ambition, but around aspiration as well, we can help people really think bigger, think differently. What excites you most about your future? What have you never done before but would like to? Is there anything you want to learn, grow, develop? It's helping people think big around the future and what excites them, around those future aspirations. The next piece is around options. And that's really, this is around the reality. So what's possible? What may be an entirely different path for you? Okay, so ambition is, I want that next promotion. Maybe that's currently not an option. Well, what's an entirely different path? What are some different options? What are the biggest barriers? How do you find your way around those? So this isn't owning this conversation as a leader. It's facilitating the discussion so that the other person can start to take action around their own development. So what are you going to do? I love the second question. What are you prepared to learn, invest, risk, and sacrifice in order to get there? What actions will you take? Who will you be accountable to? All those things really help people to start to take responsibility for their own development, with the leaders as facilitators, supporters, resource providers, and the like. The fifth piece, and it's kind of an odd piece. The fifth key shift is around accountability. And I think now really important, because now we need to get stuff done. We need to get results done. We have fewer resources. And how are we going to hold people accountable? I think we give accountability a bad name inside organizations. Quite often when we think about accountability, it's like, how are we going to hunt down the people who didn't do their jobs so that we can, punish them? Well, if we as leaders, I think a key shift we need to make as leaders is a shift away from, this is your task, let me delegate it to you, to this is the outcome that you're responsible for. This helps to provide people with autonomy, freedom, and responsibility. And it helps us as leaders to get innovation inside the organization. So sometimes when I see leaders saying, well, I'm going to look at what I have on my plate and delegate some stuff, I would invite you not to delegate stuff, but to think about outcomes that your team is responsible for. And how can you help people take responsibility for those outcomes? So I am story that I oftentimes will share around accountability is a story of an apple tree. I grew up on Long Island in New York, and there was a crab apple tree in my front yard. And I don't know if any of you know anything about crab apple trees, but they dump hundreds of apples every day, and they're not really edible. They're kind of gross by the time they hit the ground. And my job as a child, and my mother every day would say this to me, and she's from Brooklyn, and if any of you have ever heard of Brooklyn and a Long Island accent, she's pretty strong, and she still has a pretty strong Brooklyn and Long Island accent. She would say, your job is to pick up and count the apples, because wouldn't you feel guilty if somebody slipped on our front yard and got hurt and broke their neck? Like, that was it. Like, pick up and count the apples, because wouldn't you feel guilty if somebody slipped on one of those apples and broke their neck? I got paid per apple, so not worth it, a quarter of a cent. So I hated this job of picking up and counting the apples. And every day it was the same thing. Pick up and count the apples, because wouldn't you feel guilty if someone broke their neck in our front yard? And one day, my mom doesn't remember it, but the conversation changed. And she said, like, I don't know why you give me such a hard time about the apples. Your responsibility is to make sure that the front yard is clean and safe. Think about the difference. Task, pick up and count the apples because when you feel guilty. Outcome, your responsibility is to make sure that the front yard is clean and safe. Even as a kid, I was 8 years old, I remember thinking, really? If that's my responsibility to make sure the front yard is clean, I could choose how I do this. Like there were some days I paid my brothers to clean up the apples at a much lower rate than a quarter of a cent an apple. There were some days like I, organized a basketball game with the neighborhood kids, and like every day was kind of a new adventure. How am I going to make sure that the front yard is clean by the end of the day? Think about how you help people take accountability inside your teams. Would your team members say that their responsibility is to pick up and count the apples or something like it, task related? Or would they say their responsibility is an outcome? I believe we get much higher engagement, productivity, innovation when we are really specific about the outcomes that others own. And if we look at this idea of accountability, is thinking about, okay, what outcomes not only does my team own, but what outcomes do other teams own? And how do I fit in with that? Inside organizations, when we think about accountability, I'd encourage you to think about it in this pattern. The first is not task. I don't delegate tasks, but I help people recognize what crystal clear commitments they're responsible for, outcome based. And we've talked about this before. I do coach them. I have conversations that matter. I help them learn, grow, and develop. I provide feedback. We've talked about this before as well. I provide acknowledgement and appreciation. I see them as human beings. I let them know how they're adding value inside the organization. So if we think about what's going on now inside organizations, inside the world, belief is that if we shift our mindset in these 5 key topics, they're around change. Change is not going away. It's not episodic. It's continuous. And then how do I think about strategic leadership? Do I help people think about it not just from a vision and mission perspective, but from a purpose perspective? And then communication. How do I have conversations that matter rather than seeing my role as providing information? How do I engage in conversations around development? How do I help others take responsibility for their development and help provide them with conversations, resources, connections that they need? And then how do I think we all need to be responsible and accountable for making organizations work and produce at their highest level. As a leader, am I helping people take ownership and accountability for what they own? One of the things that we believe around leadership is that leadership is a journey. And I think we constantly need to learn and shift how we lead. Leaders, there's no finish line. I can't check the box and say, yep, went to that program. Yep, listened to that webinar. I got leadership down. Leadership, there is no end point. Leadership is a journey. And my invitation to you is at the end of each day to think about, okay, today was one day in my journey. What went well? And tomorrow I get a new opportunity. What might I do differently tomorrow? Thanks so much for joining us today. So appreciative, so grateful. If we can be helpful in any way, please reach out. I'm going to hand it back to Hannah. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.